Well, it's a good day for thinking about training. So here's a question that hundreds of you have messaged me to ask over the past few years. Should you be hangboarding twice a day like the people you see in YouTube videos? Only those of you who are really unfamiliar with climbing YouTube won't immediately know what I'm talking about. There have been several videos over the past few years talking about the idea of low intensity, very high frequency hangboarding protocols, both for the prevention of injury, but also for gaining finger strength. And I admit that I was reluctant to make a video answering that specific question. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with the question itself, and I will offer an answer to it in just a second. It's the way that it plays on social media algorithms that's the problem, and why I think you have to be a little bit careful if you rely on algorithm-driven platforms for your training advice. So the problem here is that YouTube pulls you down rabbit holes of very specific questions, while simultaneously distracting you from the principles that would allow you to easily answer your question on your own and not have to watch another video on it. So before I go on, let me get my direct answer to that specific question out of the way. Should you be hangboarding twice a day? I don't know. Maybe, but probably not. Like most training questions, it has an "it depends" answer. So I'm going to discuss the simple principles that will allow you to answer it straightforwardly for yourself. And this principle-based approach to thinking about training decisions was the approach that was the basis of my book 9 out of 10 Climbers Make the Same Mistakes. And I think that's why that book resonated with so many thousands of you. So since the twice a day hangboard question is downstream of other questions that need to be answered first, let's start by going back upstream up to the start of the decision tree and ask, what is hangboarding even for? So I'm going to leave endurance out of this discussion to stop this episode from getting too long. So the simple answer is, we do hangboarding to increase finger strength and resilience. To help us move forward from there, we could get a bit more specific and reframe that answer to think about the actual adaptations that we're looking for, which I would say are the following three things. One, to increase the recruitment and coordination of the muscle fiber firing in the forearm, mainly in the finger flexors. Two, to increase the muscle mass in the forearm. And three, to increase the strength and toughness of the connective tissue of the forearm and fingers. So for that last goal, I'll just flesh that out a bit. We need strength and an optimal amount of stiffness in the tendon origin of the finger flexors at the elbow, in the fascia that surround and link the compartments of the muscle belly, in the whole length of the finger flexor tendons, in the ligaments that stabilize the finger joints, and maybe especially in the annular pulleys that climbers so often tear. And the role of ligament and tendon strength also indirectly helps your finger strength for two reasons. First, if you injure a pulley or a tendon and you need time away from harder training, then that makes you weak. Your strength progression over the long term is dependent on the ratio of exposure to training versus the exposure to detraining while you're injured. So if we want to make progress, we need to avoid gaps in training, i.e. avoid injury. Secondly, even the subjective sensation that your fingers or your tendons are vulnerable to injury, climbers would often describe this as feeling tweaky. That's enough to sabotage your strength gains because it'll make you back off from the maximal efforts that are needed to stimulate improved recruitment and muscle growth. All three of our goal adaptations are long-term, slow adaptations that demand consistent incremental gains. The first one, adaptations to recruitment and coordination, is often stated as a quick adaptation, and that is true, but I still think it's better to think of it as a long-term, slow adaptation. In the first weeks, maybe the first 4 to 6 weeks of a hangboarding protocol, you may see some quite exciting or even dramatic improvements on your hangs as your nervous system adapts to the exercise. This is kind of a learning effect, and it follows a curve with steep gains at first, referred to as noob or newbie gains, followed by ever slower gains afterwards. But it's those ever slower gains that we really need, and also that provide the stimulus for the more long-lasting structural changes to muscle fibers. So these noob gains can happen to even very well-trained climbers. Your body is really sensitive to the exact nature of the stimuli that it's exposed to, and I'm sure some of you will have noticed that even if you do a lot of regular training, you can still get delayed onset muscle soreness from climbing on an angle or a hold type or a rock type that's just slightly different from what you're used to. And that explains why really good climbers, even those who use a hangboard, could have a flash of gains by just changing their protocol even slightly. At least gains that we can measure on the fingerboard itself, and that's an important point that I'll come back to. So if we look at the results of people who've tried this twice a day low intensity hangboard protocol, what have we got? Well, the first thing to say is that we don't have direct scientific evidence. What we really need to confidently answer our question is a trial with a control group, or a crossover trial where people serve as their own control. The control group is it's critical, it's really, really important. We need to control for the large placebo effect that we see when we put people on a fancy new training program, any training program, especially if they feel that it might work. For example, we know that if we give people a placebo pill and tell them that it's an anabolic steroid, they actually get big gains from training, almost as much as you would expect to see with actual steroids. So it's quite likely that if people feel like this low intensity hangboard protocol will help them, then it will. So gains from a new training program might be confounded by believing that it was going to work and not because of some other mechanism that you thought was at play. Gains are gains and they're always welcome, but maybe you didn't need to train twice a day to get them. Or you could have done something else and got similar or even better results. You know, when we take one path in training, we always have to consider that we might have had better gains with a different choice. So specific science is what we don't have. What we do have is anecdotes from various climbers published across social media and some more discussed in messages or in person. And these anecdotes are kind of all over the map, and I actually find them a little bit underwhelming. Some people try the low intensity protocol and have no strength gains to speak of and also complain of feeling tweaky. And others have gains in hang time, but that appears to plateau quite quickly. And I've not really heard of advanced climbers who've made a marked and sustained jump in their climbing standard after low intensity hangs twice a day. Those who've had the best results tend to be those who are relatively untrained, and it's difficult to justify leaning on this for evidence, since doing almost any pulling consistently on small holds will translate to gains in those who haven't been training for all that many years. So this kind of messy spectrum of results is broadly what I would expect to see from this protocol. And this is where we get to the it depends issue. If climbers are not used to loading their fingers regularly because they haven't been climbing all that long, then it doesn't surprise me that they would get gains, but also that they would get achy fingers from hangboarding twice a day. Even if they actually keep the absolute load quite low, you know, rather than ramping the total training load, perhaps they've jumped up a level and that could cause a little bit of pain. Could it cause injury in this case when we're just adding low intensity loading? You know, the low intensity work on the fingerboard is a very safe form of training, so that part isn't an issue. But it could cause the more dangerous forms of climbing that you do, such as hard bouldering, to be more risky than they otherwise would if the ligaments and tendons are not given proper rest to adapt to the total loading that's applied to them. So, you know, feeling a little bit worked from your training is fine. It might be exactly what you need. Judging what's safe and normal and what's overdoing it is kind of more of an art than a science, and I've got a long section on this in my book on climbing injuries, since it's really important to develop a keen ear for the signals coming from your body. But if you really feel like you have overdone it and your fingers are complaining, then I would say just ramp more slowly. You don't need to go straight to twice a day. It also doesn't surprise me that even well-trained climbers would see marked gains on the fingerboard itself with this low intensity protocol, especially if you're measuring hang time. If you measure hang time, I think you can achieve quite a marked increase with a comparatively small improvement in absolute strength, i.e. the force that the muscle can resist. If you express that as a percentage, then it might even sound even more dramatic. I personally prefer to track the absolute load that I can pull if I'm going to track anything at all. But to be honest, the king marker is how hard I can climb on my board, and that's what tells me if I've really made gains to speak of. And those are pretty hard won if you've been training for many years. I've only seen people making a marked jump in their actual climbing standard with low intensity hangs if they are relative novices, and I suspect that would happen with a range of alternative training methods. Conversely, when I started hangboarding myself, I also made noob gains even though I was already climbing 8B, 8B plus on sport climbs and V10, V11 on boulders after 10 years as a climber. Big gains for a few weeks and then barely perceptible gains after that. But when I went back to the rock after sticking with my protocol for 6 months, I was a totally different climber and I had a real jump in standard. And that winter I did a bunch of quite hard V13s, and the following year I climbed 8C plus on trad. I've made a whole video on that before about why that worked so dramatically for me and why it may or may not work for you. In fact, I've actually just written a whole book on the first 12 years of my climbing, explaining how I started off as a pretty average climber, struggling to keep up with my friends in my local climbing wall, but then I overtook some of my peers and ended up doing the first E11 and the hardest trad route in the world at the time. I started writing a blog in 2006 after I did the first ascent of Rhapsody, and since then I've always written or made videos about climbs that I'm doing. I've tried to show my working and explain why something's worked or hasn't worked, but I've never really gone into detail about my own apprenticeship, and the content of it largely determined why I was able to reach the level that I have. So I set out to explain all the things that allowed me to accelerate past the folk who were initially far better than I was and end up in this weird position of breaking a new grade in climbing. There were some things that were habits that I adopted, some were influences from other people, and some were decisions that I made that were kind of transformative and moved the needle. In fact, that's actually the title of the book, Moving the Needle. It amazed me that I struggled for years at an average level and then made big leaps forward down the line. And that all stemmed from some pretty simple decisions or ideas. So through exploring my own apprenticeship, the book's intended as a guide for you to be able to do the same. You know, what I learned the hard way was that what distinguishes advanced climbers is that they always do the basics. That's kind of the secret. One of the things that I've learned from YouTube is the power of a story to kind of bring these training principles alive. And so I think Moving the Needle is kind of like an applied version of my book 9 out of 10 Climbers, with all the thrills and spills that I had along the way. In the book, I discuss my own journey with the hangboard and the shock that I had when I realised how well it had worked for me when I went back to the projects that I'd been failing on before. I'll come back to fingerboarding in a second, but the reason I bring up the book is because it's just about to come out and I'd like to ask something of you. If you think that the book sounds interesting and it's something that you'd like to read, then I would really appreciate it if you would consider pre-ordering it. So I'm just about to send it to the printers and it'll be a really nice book. It'll be hardcover with lots of colour photos of first ascents that I did in Scotland in the 90s and the early 2000s. And so I'm about to have this huge expense of printing books, which is quite a stressful undertaking. So if you'd be up for pre-ordering it rather than waiting until it releases, that would really help me a lot to judge how many books to print. And if you do decide to do that, then thank you so much. There's a link below to the book, and I should say that I always sign all of the books that I send out from my website, and if you're buying a book as a gift for someone else, you can easily ask me to write something personal in it on the order page. And also, for everyone who does pre-order Moving the Needle, I'm going to add an invite to a live question and answer session that will be after the books go out, as a thank you for the support, and because it will, I dare say, it will raise some other questions about how to adapt my experience onto your own climbing. So coming back to the hangboarding, I think my protocol worked so well because I applied more general principles of training to it and then just stuck to it very consistently. Now, in Moving the Needle, I make the point that because I'd already developed my technique to a pretty high level with a lot of varied climbing outdoors over many years, I was a fairly well-rounded climber, and that meant that I had more leverage on even a small bump of finger strength. And that might be why, if you did the same hangboard protocol as me, and you had the same pound for pound strength gains, then it may not translate grade for grade in the same way that it did for me, if your technical base is not so big. You know, climbing is always the interplay and the summation of lots of different factors, with finger strength being just one, although finger strength is a very important one. So my protocol wasn't twice a day, but it was once a day. And it was max hangs only, apart from the warm-up. In fact, if you want the details, I made a follow-along video, which you can watch right after this one. In this video, I just want to stick to the why it worked. So why max hangs and not low intensity? because that's what a ton of basic physiology research shows is the most effective way to gain strength. And if you ask me how many times per week should you do it, then I just ask back, well, what else are you doing in your routine? It's an unanswerable question without knowing both how much training you can handle and how much other stuff you're doing, and also if you're willing to adapt it. So if you've got lots of fingery bouldering then in your schedule, then 2 to 4 hangboard sessions might be optimal. And if you're well trained but you can't get to a board more than like once or twice a week, then daily hangboarding might be fine. The 3 principles that we're trying to apply here are to consistently load your fingers with a heavy load, but also to do that in a manner that allows you not to be too wasted to actually pull hard. And if you don't violate those 3 principles, then you can't actually go that far wrong. And when I say it like that, it kind of sounds easy, but it isn't always all that easy for everyone. For example, some climbers are quite chilled, or they have more of an endurance phenotype, and they find it hard to produce a really explosive neural activation, from their brain to their forearm and try and rip the fingerboard off the wall. So someone like that might consistently show up for their fingerboard session, but just not make any gains. They violate that second principle. They're consistently showing up, but they're failing to achieve a sufficiently aggressive stimulus. In other words, they're doing the workout, but not the training. And these people need to teach themselves how to strength train. And when I coach climbers in person, I see that all the time. There's a lot of people who don't even realize that they have another 20% just sitting on the table. And if you can't find the aggression from within, then it might help to get someone to scream at you, because that actually works. Alternatively, you might get suboptimal gains from hangboarding because you've not properly adjusted what you're already doing, and the total amount becomes too much to recover from. When I did my hangboard protocol that gave me the big gains that I described in moving the needle, I quite dramatically reduced the other elements of my training, and I also changed 3 other elements of my recovery strategy, and I describe those in detail in the book. So, when you're adding something to your training, you always have to stand back and consider the whole picture. So, given all this discussion, I can't think of many situations where I would recommend a twice a day, low intensity protocol over the other options. In most cases, I would say that a combination of fingery bouldering and max hangs on the fingerboard would likely give better results. And that's backed up by the experience of thousands of climbers who've dramatically increased their level doing just that. So I'm not saying that twice a day low intensity doesn't do anything, just that it has a better alternative. But twice a day has 3 things going for it. 1, it's very consistent, and consistency is often what's missing in people's training programs. 2nd, it's very safe. So although you may go forwards at a slower rate, you might avoid going backwards because of injury. And thirdly, it may increase your confidence and therefore have an indirect effect on strength. It gets you very used to pulling on small edges on a daily basis, and that reduces pain, and that keeps the nervous system used to the routine, and perhaps as a result you then feel more comfortable just pulling damn hard on a small edge on a boulder problem, and therefore you get strong. But all of that can be achieved with max hangs instead. You just need to be a little bit more careful in how you integrate them into your total training load. But the payoff, if you do that, is likely to be better gains in the long term. I also do think that the original spark of an idea that came from Emil Abramson's interpretation of Keith Barr's research in the laboratory on engineered ligaments does have some merit. That research showed that the genetic switches for turning on connective tissue growth can be activated every few hours, and so frequent loading of connective tissue is a good idea, and that makes sense. We've got lots of research in all different strands of physiology showing that the body has got to move frequently to maintain health, and as soon as loading is removed, then tissue health and overall health declines. So if you're faced with the choice of sitting at a screen all day doing nothing, or walking across the room to the hangboard for a few seconds, then do that. However, if you can make your lifestyle more active and just go climbing more often instead, even if it's just soloing a couple of easy routes for an hour or just moving around on some big holds, then that will probably serve the same purpose. Anything that achieves consistent finger loading is going to help. And so the argument is more about which method works a little bit better. So the lesson I take from Keith Barr's research is just to be constantly active and frequently use any joint that you want to prevent getting weak. It doesn't matter whether you pull yourself off the ground under a hangboard or you pull heavy weights off the ground with your fingers. What matters for strong fingers is steady ramping, consistency, and pulling really hard. So don't get distracted from those things, and I'll see you in the next episode.